Hey everyone, my name is Lindsay Buroker. I am a science fiction and fantasy author with quite a few books out, and I'm able to do it full time. And one of the questions I always get is, like, how do I finish my first book that I've been working on for 10 years? Or, once the book's out there, how do I focus on all the marketing stuff you have to do to actually sell copies? And I thought it would be nice to talk with my friend Amy Voros, she runs Creative Catapult Coaching, and her focus is helping people that have ADHD. And I'm going to ask her to tell us what exactly that is in a minute. But even if you don't think that's you, it's very possible some of this may apply to you. And we're just going to talk about some tips for like coping with things and maybe helping you finish those projects and, just focusing and finishing and then some of the hurdles too that people struggle with when they're you just don't even know why you're struggling when you sit down to write. So Amy, after I've rambled here for our introduction, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be involved in coaching people with ADHD?
Hey, Lindsay, thanks. This is a, fun project for me to be able to have a space to just talk a little bit more about what I'm doing. I've been coaching people for about 10 years. The reason I focus on ADHD coaching is in my early 30s, suddenly I discovered a reason for a lot of my own stumbling and inability to complete things was ADHD. I've always been sort of a person who can find a way to get through and around and over almost any struggle, but the consistency and the effort were just really, really hard. And working from home during a snowstorm, I ended up just not being able to focus or get any traction without being in an office environment and having deadlines of people needing things from me over the course of a day. And in my associative thinking, somehow I stumbled on a quiz and took it and just kind of did like a triple take at it, did a whole bunch of research, and then went into my doctor with like 15 documents trying to justify that I thought I had ADHD. And she's like, yeah, that's probably an option. So I didn't expect anyone to believe me because so often our stereotypes of ADHD are socially constructed and don't necessarily show the full range of what's going on. We think about, children, especially young boys, who must have the original diagnostic criteria were fit around, but there are other ways it shows up in other people, and it's certainly not a function of intelligence. It's completely separate from it. And so a lot of people can make it for a long time, sometimes with a crazy amount of effort, but eventually finding out why you're putting in so much effort and not getting the same level of return as your peers is a really interesting piece. So about the time I found out I had ADHD, my company did layoffs. I was one of them. I went back to school, and luckily school gave me a lot of structure and really played to a lot of my strengths. And about this time, I also came across the concept that, there are people that, help people figure out their own ways and their own solutions to work with something. And this was really exciting. So that's the long, rambling version of my ADHD and how I started coaching.
No, that's great. And I think it's, especially, I won't say our ages, but maybe back in like the 80s or 90s or 70s or whenever people might have been kids in school, this is probably a little less common to get diagnosed unless kids were like really disruptive in the classroom. That's kind of how I remember it. So there's probably a lot of adults out there undiagnosed.
There certainly are, and I've often thought that saying you have ADHD is kind of like saying you have a fever. There's a lot of reasons that can go into it, everything from other medical conditions looking like it to, especially for a lot of younger kids, it can sometimes be looked at. If you're the youngest kid in a class, you might be more likely to be pegged with ADHD these days because you just aren't developmentally at the same level as your peers because you're you know, if you're born in September and your school starts and does their cutoffs based on September 30th, you could be up to a full year younger than some of the other kids in your class. And a lot of people with ADHD, the developmental skills, often the executive functions, so sort of the planning and a lot of stuff that we do can be several years behind, but sometimes it's just we all mature at different rates. And so there's probably both under and over diagnosis, but you know, it doesn't go away. You may find ways by the time you're an adult to sort of compensate for a lot of the behaviors. However, there's still a lot of variation in the statistics, but you know, somewhere between 7 to 10% of the population is, according to most of the, as close to a consensus as you're going to get, probably impacted by ADHD within their lives, or in their lives, not within.
for their whole lives, kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
You mentioned a list that you kind of found that you were reading originally. So I'm curious, and many people will probably be curious, what does ADHD look like in adults? How would I know if maybe I have this?
It's complicated, you know, and that's not to say that it isn't clear, but sometimes it's more a diagnosis of elimination versus, you know, a whole set of characteristics. So it can be, you know, trouble getting to appointments on time, trouble keeping spaces organized, blurting out things, you know, short-term memory issues, emotional regulation challenges, you know, again, a hard time. Yeah, it's, you know, and any one of these are things that people, the entire population, we see aspects of this, you know, from time to time, but it's more the consistency, you know, and struggling in environments where other people might be being successful. So part of it, you know, really is your personality too, and do you find a good fit for your skills and your traits? One of my challenges sometimes being concise and concrete. So that's, you know, I can think in a big picture, but pulling up the details and having them in my memory when I want them is one of my challenges.
So I've known you since 5th grade, and your room, every time I've ever visited you as an adult and as a kid,
not go there.
you know? Unorganized, we'll say. So I don't know, is that a common trait? Because you mentioned organization.
And, you know, a lot of it is the ability to execute, but then also if somebody doesn't find a lot of meaning or purpose in something, for most of us with ADHD, it becomes very, very difficult to maintain that, you know. I'm able to function in my space even though it doesn't meet, you know, what society feels should be the way things look. I'm lucky because I live by myself, so as long as my space is functional for me, I can make it happen. But, you know, I've worked with clients on trying to figure out how to make laundry happen, on top of how to meet, you know, the deadlines for their, the team that they're leading. So, you know, I mean, I work with a lot of people in, you know, software, so very high achieving, very high profile. And for some reason, a lot of the things that are supposed to be easy for us just really are not.
Yeah, I can kind of sympathize with, I kind of found a similar list for autism as an adult, you know, and one of the things I struggle with is I'm really focused, I can finish writing a novel, no problem, but at the same time, oh, I didn't pay the bills for the last 3 months because the mail stacked up by the door, and I'm like, well, I'll get to it eventually. So I don't know, are there any commonalities between autism and ADHD?
Well, they both fall under the sort of a term that's emerging called neurodiversity. So difference is sort of in the spectrum of, you know, how humans exist in the world. People with autism can also have ADHD, but they are not mutually exclusive. But some of the challenges, with the hyper focus, are really focusing on something to the detriment of everything else, probably can be a challenge.
I didn't give you this question ahead of time.
That's
I
okay.
might run
And
off the rails, and Amy's like, hey, this was not on the list of
no,
questions you
actually,
said.
because it's a good question, and I also, I've got a really high ethical piece of I don't want to misspeak and give people information that, is misleading. They're both neurobiological differences which change sort of how we interact with the world compared to neurotypical. And again, these all feel like very niche pieces, and the labels are sometimes empowering, but they can also be really disempowering. So I see them as a framework, and this is again getting away from autism overlapping with ADHD, but we all sort of tend to operate further away from what our society deems normal, or if we're seen as normal, it may come at a really high cost of adapting to be seen as acceptable.
Yeah, kind of there's always this work to like present a socially acceptable facade. And I think you mentioned that boys are more often diagnosed, like they seem to be like women are, I don't know, kind of trained from birth, girls to like fit into the society, and maybe we're a little better at faking it.
Well, yeah, there's a very, very high social pressure, and a lot of it's semi-conscious, to fit in, to be neat, to be clean. One of the biggest challenges for women with ADHD is, a lot of the executive function work for planning, for family planning, organizing, and executing is deemed women's work. And so women can often feel like they're failing because they can't juggle all of the expectations that we're supposed to be able to juggle as women, especially if you're having a family and a career. The mental load takes an even strongerly negative impact on women with ADHD because we just can't execute this as easily. And, if you're not doing it, you're just obviously a failure.
Yes, it's great to feel like a failure. But
There's very little for anyone's long-term productivity or ability to get where they want to be, which is just terrible. And yet I don't have a way to change the world and culture at large.
right. So we're going to kind of swing this back into some productivity and coping stuff, but I did want to ask for people who might think that this is kind of sounding familiar, is there a point like when you're an adult that it makes sense to seek a diagnosis and possibly look into medication?
Um, Anytime you're really struggling and your mental health is on the line, getting support is always a good place to look into. If you really feel like you're failing and, or struggling, or that life is challenging, and sometimes those feelings can be associated with depression or other items, other mental health diagnoses. But when you suddenly realize that you're looking and having issues and more effort or different effort isn't necessarily working, then going ahead and looking at a way to, get a diagnosis for ADHD or any other mental health challenge is probably worth looking into. ADHD meds are only one of a multitude of ways of dealing with ADHD. ADHD is usually best dealt with from a whole multitude of directions, lifestyle adjustments, possibly coaching, possibly therapy, possibly meds, meditation, awareness, and sort of, understanding yourself and how you show up is really one of the better overall tools for managing your life.
I think it's important to mention, because people doing the math probably realize we're Generation X, and I feel like our generation and maybe previous ones are less likely to go to like therapy or maybe seek help. Where I feel like the millennials are more like, they're just like, yeah, I saw my therapist this week, it's cool. And they don't think anything of it. Are there any, I don't know, tips or I guess I want to tell people it's perfectly fine, it's normal, and it can really help you because I know you've kind of gone through this path yourself and probably
Yeah,
find it super helpful.
and so a lot of it is starting to shift from seeing it as a personal character flaw to understanding, that part of it's neurology and your brain is just different, and that's fine. But yeah, seeking out help is, in whatever form you're doing, hopefully is going to do nothing but benefit, give you more tools, more options, more skills. Another important thing to realize is meds may change your neurochemistry, but that doesn't mean that you're going to suddenly have the skills that just quiets your brain enough and changes sort of the way your neurons are firing so that you may be able to execute. So you might have to learn some skills that you've sort of missed along the way. And that's a place where people often beat themselves up. Why can't I calendar? Why can't I stay on top of this? Well, if your brain wasn't really in a good place to let you learn how to do that in the first place, that might be something that, you have to, that it's okay to spend the energy learning now because you are where you are. You can't jump, you're not going to learn to run a marathon in one day. It's going to take some time to build up, the skills, and, that's going to help you get where you want. But, it takes some time in a lot of ways to learn, to work through your own, how are you going to accept where you are and shift your mindset into, changing things, and how can I change things? And that, working with a team and as part of a group with some support, whether that's a medical team or whether with, friends or some professionals, that help is okay. And that's something that as a very, very individualistic society, especially for older generations, and by that I mean probably, me
Are
and
we an older
above,
generation now? This is horrible.
I'm not sure that, and I'm still trying to get used to this whole midlife thing. But, I've got clients in their 60s. People realize that, I'm tired of my life being like this. And so I'm ready to, put in some effort to finding a different way to do it.
All right, cool. I think that's a good introduction and a lot of good things for people to think about. And if it does ring some bells, we promise some practical coping strategies possibly. So I actually asked a couple of my friends they have finished some projects. They both want, to finish novels, and but it's not like their full-time job. They're doing it on the side like most people do when they're starting out. So I asked them for a couple questions, and my friend Sarah asked, how do you stay on track for long-term projects and effectively break them down into achievable daily goals?
That, if we had $1 million answer, I would love to give it. It's a lot of it is practice, and starting to have an understanding of the system and what you need to happen. Do you understand what's involved and what you're trying to do? And then do, smaller pieces that don't feel overwhelming for you, which that looks different for everyone. Some of my clients I've worked with that do writing, the struggle to fit writing in with with project management on top of, working full time, and writing, it is a struggle, especially with ADHD when you want something that's novel and sort of makes your brain fire. So breaking down a step, is this something you actually are wanting to do, or are you feeling an obligation to do it, can be a bigger can be a really important piece to look at. Is this something you're doing for you, or is this something you're doing because you feel you should? And that's a whole different set of things. But really breaking it down into small pieces that you can achieve, and, you know, being excited about that, you know, is that you finish the outline and, you know, you really feel that you had a chance to understand where the characters are coming from. Another one of my favorite thoughts is GEMO, and that's an acronym I learned: good enough, move on. So letting go of perfection, and just sometimes you just have to start and you just have to do it, and just know that this round is going to suck.
Yeah, I know a lot of writers struggle with that. Sarah's actually an editor for other people's manuscripts, so I think she's very I don't know if critical is the right word, but it's just like, you know, it's got to be good. It's got to be good, right? You know, and I understand that for sure. I think a lot of writers deal with that.
Yeah, I wish I had a more concrete answer, but there's so many factors that go into pulling that apart that, you know, looking at your own motivation and then really breaking it into, you know, what sometimes even micro steps, and then matching it to your energy at the time of day. You know, if you're trying to write on top of being a family and doing it full time, you know, if you're trying to write at 9 p.m. when you're exhausted, maybe that's not the right time to do it, because, and so then how do you find a block where you've got more energy at a different time of day? And so much of it is, you know, pulling it apart on a personal level.
Yeah, I think a lot of writers I know that have pushed through and you know, achieve stuff even on top of a full-time job and with family, they often get up earlier. And as a non-early morning riser, I'm always like, oh, whatever. You know, I was always like 1 a.m. now it's time to write. But I guess there's some value in figuring out when you work best. Maybe even,
It's huge.
yeah, like keeping track of what word count you achieved when you tried writing it 5 a.m. or 1 p.m. during lunch hour, or versus 10 p.m. or something, and seeing when you're most
Yeah, you know,
productive.
or you lock your, you know, learning to draw boundaries at work. And so, you know, maybe when you're sort of wrapping up your day at the office outside of COVID times, you know, you stay and you decide that, you know, every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, you're gonna, you know, just block off a 30-minute chunk of time and, you know, right before you go home, you know, so that you don't have some of those other distractions. And so carving it out in ways that work for you and giving yourself some flexibility in how to adjust and adapt to it, and yet stick to the overarching goal over time. And if it were that easy, I think we'd all be doing a lot more. But, you know, when your heart is in it, sticking with it and finding some encouragement and some outside accountability, whether that's, you know, a writing partner, you know, or a coach or an online group, can be great towards helping sustain the excitement and the momentum.
That's true. One of the ways I first started finishing things, because I actually struggled in the beginning, I had a lot of half-started manuscripts, was joining an online writing workshop. And I think just seeing other people succeed, like getting deals with agents or selling short stories to magazines. And I was like, my writing's just as good as those guys. You know, it was very motivating for me to like, I can finish too, you know, so.
Yeah. Well, and I think sometimes too, having the ability to have the conversation with somebody else that, oh, they're also having a hard time, it's not just me, can be really normalizing, so you can stop spending as much energy beating yourself up and shift it back into doing the project or finding another way to stick with the project instead of, there's a lot to be said for, you know, community or connecting with others. Well, and then also realizing too, and this is again, learning the process of what you're doing is often way more involved than people think it is. So there's not only the, you know, the structure of a story and, you know, what's involved in writing the structure of a story, but then how does your work and how does your output happen? And those are two very separate, very large, very complex ideas that we often forget both take time. And so unintentionally, we pick something far more ambitious than we're able to easily achieve.
Right.
And that's
For
hard to learn.
I know as somebody who read a lot of epic fantasy, and I was like, well, I'm going to write epic fantasy naturally. And you don't realize it's something with like 8 point of view characters and that it's going to be like 800 pages when you're done. Might be kind of a big thing to do for your first novel.
You can do it. Somebody else has done it, therefore it's obviously achievable.
Yeah.
So sometimes how do you find, or another question that, do you need to adjust your expectations to be something you can do? And while that often feels like lowering your standards, it might be enough to, how do you generate the success and feel good without exhausting yourself so that you still want to do another project?
I think with writers too, we're a little naive. We just think it's just easy. You write down the story. I always use the skiing analogy, and I've talked to you about this before. Like,
God,
if you were,
skiing, don't, you do it easy. I don't, and that's,
well, but
say brain tumors aside.
if you were learning to ski and you got to the top, you got off the lift and you're like, oh, look, a double black diamond. I'm probably not going to go down that yet. Like, it's really obvious because it's a cliff, but we don't see that as like, I'm going to tackle this historical epic saga. We don't realize that it's the same with writing. Try starting with something a little easier, and then later when you're better skilled, you can tackle that cliff.
Yeah. Well, and how do you give yourself permission to change the focus and not see it as a failure of shifting the goal that you set out to achieve? And, if you change your mind about what you need to undertake, is that a failure? And that's something I've struggled with.
Well, maybe it's just part of the learning process too, and you can progressively take on bigger challenges.
It is, but again, that's part of the process, is learning to see it that way and not being so disappointed in yourself when you realize what you've undertaken is far bigger than you anticipated. And, maybe it's okay to change the scale and not see it as a failure. But
Well,
that takes a whole lot of mental
maybe
work
that
for some people,
maybe that can bring us into
included.
our next question, which is actually from Sarah again about her nephew who is about 10, and he's been diagnosed with ADHD. And one of the things he struggles with is negative self-talk. And, that's part of what has been identified as part of his disorder. So do you have any tips? First off, I guess, what is negative self-talk, and how can you kind of overcome that?
Negative self-talk is, well, self-talk in general is that internal dialogue you've got going on with yourself, whether you're talking through something or, the judgments and thoughts of, oh God, my apartment's a mess still. And so negative self-talk is often, how you judge yourself or are very critical of yourself. I'm never going to finish this project. I can't do this. I'm stupid. Everyone else can do it. Why can't I? It's really pretty common in ADHD. And there's, a certain level with meds changing the chemistry of your brain, meditation changing your ability to sort of step away from your thoughts, to working with some of the negative self-thought. That is what I get for trying to hit buttons. That being said, by the time most kids are 12, especially those with ADHD, they've gotten up to 20,000 more helpful and corrective negative pieces of data being told to them. Focus more, try harder, and that really has an impact on your self-esteem. Most people, if you could try harder, they would. They're not doing it out of challenge. So understanding what it is, and telling somebody just to flip it in their head isn't the answer. I don't necessarily. It's a process to change negative self-talk, and so finding ways for somebody to be good at something, whether that's sports or planning an event for the family, and being acknowledged for it. But part of it, I think, really has to be something you care about. but it's not a fast change. I wish it was.
Yeah, I always feel like there's always these gurus that are telling you to like get up every morning and affirm this and tell yourself you love yourself in the mirror. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, I can never make myself do that. Maybe there'd be some value in it, but it's hard. I don't know. I feel like there's a mental difficulty.
There is some, a lot of the positive psychology movement, there is something to learning to be a little bit nicer to yourself and to use some of the positives, but it's not easy. And it's not something that's going to change your internal dialogue overnight. And it often, can be a sign of, bigger issues going on. If you're getting the messages as an ADHD kid that everything you do is wrong, at some point you just get defensive, and it's like the world is, the brain looks for ways to affirm sort of what it knows and believes. And if you're getting repeated reinforcement that everything you do is wrong, is trying to counter that with positivity by yourself is not super productive. Yeah, it's a bigger issue.
Is there any worth in, like, I've heard it suggested that instead of saying like allowing yourself to say like, dude, I suck at that, I suck, rather like, well, that project kind of sucked, it didn't go as I thought, but maybe the next one I can do better, learning what what went
Yeah,
wrong.
well, and I mean, a lot of times with my clients, we talk about, failure is just a data point. And so trying to remove some of the emotional from it, and so when you can sort of disengage with that judgment, over time, you can see it as, okay, you can start to also pull out some aspects that were, positive. I'd like to repeat the fact that, yeah, every day for the last week, I have written, 400 words a day, compared to a month ago where I wasn't even touching the computer. And so seeing things as progress. And so, yeah, shifting sort of your perspective over time can help move away from some of the negative patterns, but it's not consistent and it's not instinctive.
It's a good point about everybody, failure, it happens to everybody. We don't see it though necessarily, like so-and-so has 50 novels out, which I do, but I always tell people it took me 7 years to finish the first one. And there's so many half-started projects, especially in the beginning. So every writer that is successful probably has that same background. Like almost nobody is just like, oh, it magically came out of the air and it became a best-selling novel on the first try.
Yeah, no, I wish one of my favorite sort of drawings, or, I don't really want to call it a meme, because before memes were really a thing. But they're two squares next to each other, and says success, what we think it is. And it's a straight line, sort of beginning to end, going upwards. Success, what it is the second panel. And then, it's got this line that's all over and backtracking and looping, and success, what it really looks like. And so, yeah, it's rarely a linear path. And for a society that values consistency and linearness, remembering that success almost never presents that way can be really hard.
Right, especially when you don't become aware of the successful person until they break out, and that's like the first they appear to you. So my next question is from Rue, and she asks, how can you manage the brain inertia that for some people is writer's block, but for those of us with cognitive issues is going to be a lot more than that? Like sitting there and wanting to write, but not being able to get your body/brain to do it. Big issue for her.
I feel you on that one. Part of my own challenge, on top of ADHD for a number of years, was a slow growing brain tumor that just sapped all my energy and I couldn't figure out what was going on. Another complex issue, and sometimes, is, do you know the cause of it? And so again, without wanting to sound like I've got the solutions, are you eating well? Are you sleeping well? Are you taking care of some of the underlying issues? And knowing that, especially with health issues, some days are good, some days are crap no matter what you do. And so how do you, how do you give yourself enough grace and compassion to try again later, try again at a different time? Again, going back to some of the other pieces, is there a way that you can match if you can look at energy patterns as an overall function, do you tend to be better on Monday and Tuesday because you've had the weekend as downtime? And so maybe how do you focus your writing in those periods where you know that you're overall more likely to be productive? Or what kinds of things do you do? And sometimes you just have to learn to recognize that you're not being productive and stop and come back and try again. It's not as easy as I'd like it to be. And, again, the more, God, I can't think of the thing I want, but, another piece that I've often told people is slow down to speed up. So if you need a break, stop trying to force yourself to do it. Take a break, do something else, whether that's take a nap, going for a bike ride, what other projects can you get off your plate to free up some of your energy? Because we put such a phenomenal number of demands on ourselves that, sometimes there just literally is not capacity. And what can you do to increase your personal capacity? And with medical issues that can rear their head when you don't always know what's going on, it can be really frustrating. And I can speak to that, and I still have those weeks, and it sucks.
Yeah, it's brain tumors extreme. Hopefully most of us are not dealing with
Yeah,
that.
that's the
And
hope.
hopefully you're doing better now.
Definitely doing better. And, it's not that I want to bring this up and make it an issue about me. I mean, although I'm trying to use myself as an example because I've been there. But when you don't understand what's going on, sometimes you can do all the right things and it's still not enough.
I feel like it's easy for us to be dismissive too about how much you mentioned like diet and sleep and not being too stressed. I know with myself, I had a horrible diet as a kid. I was such a sugar junkie, and I wasn't measuring my blood sugar levels when I was like in my 20s and still chugging Gatorades and candy and stuff. But I know when I changed my diet, because I had to, because I had so many health issues going on, and started eating lower carb, less sugar, so having less of the blood sugar swings, that was huge. Like I was really prone to like depression, especially when I was in the Army, and just like you can't do anything except come home and like play video games or watch TV. It's just, and it, for me, and I'm not saying this is everybody's answer, when my diet got better, it got a lot easier to do the things I wanted to do in addition to working 40 hours a week or whatever. All right, next question. Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Did you want to comment on that, or should I?
I was just going to say, only in thinking that, there are lots of people that say that, here's the perfect ADHD diet. And I'm not a nutritionist. I'm of the opinion that generally eating better, eating more protein and less processed foods is probably helpful for ADHD. But like so many things, there's not one diet that's going to change your world, but, your body also needs a certain amount of nutrition and nutrients to function. And so are you getting that? Wherever
Right.
you are.
Well, and there are a whole lot of reasons we could be nutrient deficient too. And boy, those vitamin Bs and everything plays into like creating the neurotransmitters that you need to have like the equilibrium in your brain.
Yeah, and I will definitely say I can point to some medical studies, that indicate this is X, Y, and Z, and I'm not going to tell you what to eat, what to take, what to do, because I'm not a medical thing in that medical thing. a medical professional. And, you know, within coaching, we don't necessarily give advice or tell people how to solve their problems. We can help them investigate ways to get to where they want to be, but my position is not necessarily to give advice. And I guess maybe that's a lot of where I, you know, I'm hesitant to say, this is how you're going to solve this problem, even, you know, with these very specific, general specific questions you're giving me.
Right. And with some of that stuff, it almost takes like a health crisis for a lot of people to really be motivated enough to change. And, you know, like I don't want to tell anybody either, like, this is a diet you have to be on in order to feel better. That's just what was for me. But let's move on to the next question from Rue, which is very specific. So I'm going to ask you to define this after I ask this. How can people with rejection-sensitive dysphoria deal with perceived rejections from reviews, sales rankings, emails, etc.?
Ooh, rejection sensitive dysphoria. That's a really painful one. And from the limited amount I know about rejection sensitive dysphoria, which is basically you feel far more reactive and painful internal sensations from perceived or real criticism. And everything that I've read is, you know, because they come on so suddenly, honestly, medication is one of the most effective ways to deal with it. And I'll throw a couple links in, but I think the stats I was seeing was, you know, almost over 90% of people with ADHD feel criticism or perceived criticism more extensively, isn't quite the right word I want, but more powerfully than most of the population. And that can be one of the challenges. Rejection sensitive dysphoria can be a co-occurring diagnosis, but because it comes out of the blue and the physiological reactions are so fast that even cognitive behavioral therapy, they say, is not as effective. But really, being able to name it and know kind of why it's happening, you know, in the greater scheme of things might, you know, just know that it's not entirely you. And then you can put some perspective on it as the feelings are receding. But also then continuing to find positive ways and places that you are being successful is, you know, part of overall good mental health. And rejection sensitive dysphoria is a little bit less my area of specialty.
I think that writers are very prone to, even if they don't have it to that extreme, we know the whole goal is to get published, at which point you're going to get reviews and you're going to get criticism, and it's going to happen. Nobody loves every book. And for me, I just kind of, because I'm quite sensitive to that, so I try to distance myself. I don't read my reviews on Amazon. I figure they're for the reader, because it will be sometimes, and sometimes people email you. They're so kind to like list the criticisms in an email personally to you. They've never met you, but they feel, you know, that's cool.
Yeah,
And it
yeah,
ruins like the whole day. Like your whole mood just goes,
sucks.
you know, so it's
I mean,
tough.
that sucks. I think you've got a great strategy there in just how do you not engage and how do you keep enough distance to the best of your ability to not be sucked into negativity that is, you know, not relevant, you know, and that's a fine line, I think, when you're working with an editor or, you know, if a publisher rejects you, you know, how do you both, you know, take it as not personally, you know, and realizing that, you know, most people submit X number of times, hundreds of times, however many it is, you know, before you get an acceptance. And, you know, where do you go through a different route to publish, whether that's self-publishing or, you know, how do you see it as non-personal? And some of that too is building up some experience over time. Yeah, I'm always concerned that people are finding, what I'm doing good enough, and then we can get into all sorts of other ethical and philosophical challenges.
Well, maybe it's a little comforting at least to know that everybody deals with it, even like a really successful author. The more you're out there, the more criticism you're going to receive.
Well, and the more visible you are, the more likely it is that somebody is not going to have the same opinion and may or may not share it kindly with you. And that being said, if you know that you're already sensitive to criticism, that can almost be it can stop some people in their tracks. And so what can you do to sort of figure out how to deal with it, because it will happen. And that's, the anticipated rejection is a big deal with rejection sensitive dysphoria, but how do you then go to stop it from becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy, which, you're not even putting anything out there for fear of being rejected.
And I don't know how much it helps, but sometimes I get good emails too. I mean, probably 9 out of 10 emails are positive. I really enjoy this. And I'll save some of those. I got like a folder, and I always figure like, well, if I'm really feeling down after one, I can like, well, look at all these other people that said like, dude, you're my favorite author, or I really enjoyed these characters. But I don't know, it seems like human nature to just focus on the one negative one out of the
Very much
batch.
so. It very much is. And that's a great technique is, to compile a list or a thing and, a source of good stuff. And, you can do some practice and some training to continue to give more weight to those positive interactions and less weight to, the dramatic minority of negative interactions. Historically, as tribal animals, there's been a lot of research that, our brains are primed to focus on that negative stuff because it literally meant our survival.
Right, you want to remember that valley where the saber-toothed tiger pounced on your clan last winter, so you don't go back in there.
Right, and so, or that negative, you did something cruel to, somebody's, the chieftain's son, and so you didn't get food for the winter. And so, your survival in the past may have really depended on people liking you. And so those people that, for whatever reason, express that they don't, it feels like you're being rejected, and your nervous system is like, goes into fight or flight, and, oh my God, this is literally a safety, life or death issue. Even if, somebody emailing you nasty comments on your book probably isn't going to mean you're going to die tonight, it feels like it.
All right, well, another one where hopefully it's some comfort, at least for people to know that everybody is dealing with this, whether you're ADHD or not, probably to some extent. All right,
Yeah.
last questions from me. For authors who have, finished the first novel, maybe they've got a few out there and they've realized, okay, well, I have to market it so that people will actually buy it. And that, that's usually the case whether you self-publish or you're traditionally published in this day and age. And there's just about a zillion things that people advise doing, everything from building a social media platform to learning Amazon and Facebook ads to writing short stories to use as reader magnets to get people onto a mailing list. And I know it's
Are you overwhelming yourself yet?
I know it's super daunting. Do you have any tips for people to focus on sort of all these things that they feel that they have to do while still finding time to write the next book?
First off, realizing you don't have to do everything and you can't do everything. For ADHD people, especially if you have the resources, figuring out how do you outsource some of it. I use technology as much as I can to my, advantage. Whether that's using Trello boards and or bullet journaling and listing everything I can think of that I need to do. But most of the time I've been a bootstrapper, so I, haven't had the luxury of hiring a marketing team or, somebody to assist with my social media or, finally after 10 years, I finally hired somebody to do my website, and it was novel. I mean, I have the ability to learn and teach myself a whole lot of stuff, but the fact that I didn't spend the energy having to come up to speed on new tech has given me a lot of energy to, focus on other things that I'm actually better at and enjoy far more than trying to fight with WordPress. So listing, finding resources or a roadmap from somebody who's done it before, and sometimes if you're looking at advertising or, marketing, how do you figure out what's going to give you the biggest return on your time and energy, and yeah, you probably can't be on 27 platforms because social media can take up your entire mental, physical bandwidth and then trigger all of those, emotional arguments and discussions that may have nothing to do with your ability to write and get content out there. Plus, you probably still have a life to manage. So realizing it may not go as quickly as you hope it would, and sticking with it anyway, which sounds kind of like a cop-out way to answer.
Right. Well, for me, I've kind of found that like my favorite days are when I'm just writing. I don't have anything else going on. That's the luxury of being able to do this full time, I know. But then some days, you just know that maybe you got an appointment or there's things going on, and I'm like, well, this is going to be an admin day. And that's when I sort of do some of the setting up ads, answering email, and
Yeah.
that because it's hard to do both be creative and do this other stuff at the
Task
same time.
blocking is kind of what you're doing. So grouping similar tasks or giving yourself, a period where you're going to focus on admin, or you're going to focus on marketing, or you're going to focus on writing. And then matching those to sort of your interest and energy level can be another great way of doing it. And so sometimes some way of, okay, my marketing is like whatever I can do in the 3 hours I've allocated this morning that's what gets done.
All right. Well, I think that we've talked for almost an hour. I was imagining we'd be like 15, 20 minutes,
You and I somehow managed to talk and then talk some more.
Well, actually, this is pretty normal for, I have a podcast, and so for those that have heard my podcast, we're always over an hour. I'm like, oh, this will take like 30 minutes. This will just be a short day. I don't know. Writers got to chat when they actually get out of their introvert shells and talk to other people. Where can people find you online, and what are you working on, or what are you up to right now?
Well, right now I'm actually trying to let the world know I exist. So a lot of my work currently is, how do I show up as the version of myself? And right now that self that I am wants to do more coaching. I'm mostly experimenting, what platforms myself are going to help me get visibility. So I've been playing around with both LinkedIn and Facebook. And then I've got my website up at creativecatapultcoach.com. And I work really mostly with people. I'm more interested in the one-on-one interactions necessarily than kind of this broad platform that's going to put me as an expert. But, it's something I haven't tried, and I like novelty. So, I'm a lifelong learner, and it's kind of like, so my projects right now are what can I learn as I move into a different space?
Yeah, so you totally feel us on the marketing side, because I know you
Oh,
mentioned
yeah.
you usually get your clients from directories, but now you're
Yeah.
like, let me try to create a platform so people can find me who need me. And it's the same as
Right.
authors.
Well, and for a lot of years, I mean, I maintain a professional presence on, both children and adults with attention deficit disorder, or CHAD, the ICF, which is the International Coach Federation, which is my credentialing body. I also have a professional listing with the ADHD Coaches Organization. So usually people who come to me already know that they're looking for a coach. And it's been great, and most of my people I work with anywhere from, 6 months to my longest client. We've been working together for 10 years. And so engagements can be anything from really short to sort of a long-term dedication to time and space for, my clients to think about what's important for them.
All right, sounds good. And there was creativecatapultcoach.com.
Correct.
And you're also on Facebook, right?
I am on Facebook, Creative Catapult Coaching. Anyway.
They'll find it. They can do a search. All right, well, it was great talking to you, and I hope you have a great week.
Yeah, I hope you do too. Thanks, Lindsay.
All right, and thanks for listening, everyone. Bye-bye.
See you guys.
Where's the button? It's not in the
Exactly.
same place. I had the same